Before the first light appeared over the fields of Ukraine, the land remained still. Night had not fully ended. The sky carried only a faint line of pale gray along the eastern horizon. The earliest signal that morning would soon arrive. Across the open farmland, a gentle wind moved through tall grass and empty rows of crops that had long since been harvested. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that soldiers on a front line learn to study carefully, because silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means rest, sometimes it means waiting, and sometimes it means that somewhere beyond the horizon, movement is already beginning. At the base of a low hill overlooking those fields, a Ukrainian scout adjusted the strap across his shoulder. The equipment resting against his chest was light enough to carry quietly, but important enough that he checked it twice before starting the climb. His assignment that morning was simple: reach the hilltop before sunrise. Watch the fields, report what he saw. The hill itself was not large. From a distance, it looked almost like a gentle rise in the farmland, the kind of slope farmers had crossed for decades while moving between fields. But during the war in Ukraine, that hill had become something else, a lookout point. From the top, a soldier could see across several kilometers of land, open fields, narrow dirt roads, tree lines that cut through the farmland like long green barriers. And somewhere beyond those tree lines, Russian forces had been reported moving during the previous days. That was why the watch had been assigned. The Ukrainian scout began walking up the slope slowly, each step pressed softly against the dry grass beneath his boots. He moved carefully, not because the hill was difficult to climb, but because quiet movement had become second nature after months along the front. The air carried the coolness of night. Above him, the last stars remained visible against the dark sky. Behind him, further down the slope, a small Ukrainian defensive position rested near a line of bushes where soldiers had spent the night watching the same fields. From there, the hill rose gradually upward. The scout had been chosen for the early watch because he knew the terrain well. He had studied the layout of the fields during previous patrols. He knew where the dirt roads curved. He knew which tree lines hid low ground and which ones revealed open areas between farms. That knowledge mattered because when the sun finally rose, the landscape would change, shadows would move, details would appear, and anything traveling across those fields would become easier to see. The scout reached a point halfway up the hill and paused briefly. He turned slightly and looked back down the slope. The Ukrainian position behind him remained quiet, a faint shape of sandbags and equipment barely visible in the dim light. One of the soldiers below lifted a hand in acknowledgement. The scout returned the gesture with a small nod, then he continued climbing. The grass near the top of the hill grew shorter. Wind moved more freely across the open ground. From here, the land ahead began to open fully into view. Long stretches of farmland, scattered buildings, thin dirt roads cutting between fields, and beyond those roads, distant tree lines marking the edge of several small villages across that region of Ukraine. The scout reached the crest of the hill just as the horizon brightened slightly. Morning had not yet arrived, but the darkness had begun to fade. He lowered himself into a shallow position behind a patch of taller grass and rested his binoculars carefully against his eyes. From the hilltop, the entire field below stretched outward like a map. He began scanning slowly from left to right. A dirt road, empty, a field recently plowed, still, a distant farmhouse, quiet. The scout continued watching. Minutes passed. The sky brightened slightly more. The line between land and horizon grew clearer. Somewhere in the distance, a bird crossed the sky. Closer to the hill, the wind brushed across the grass again. The scout lowered the binoculars briefly and listened. Nothing unusual. He lifted them again and continued scanning the fields. The routine might seem simple, but along the Ukrainian front, quiet observation often carried enormous importance. Seeing movement early could change the entire course of a morning. And for the soldiers positioned behind the hill, the scouts' watch was their first warning if anything appeared across those fields. After another long moment of scanning the horizon, the scout spoke softly. The words were quiet, almost thoughtful, but they carried the calm weight of someone who understood the importance of his task. Let the morning come. The binoculars remained steady in his hands. The sky continued growing brighter over Ukraine, and from the hilltop, the Ukrainian scout kept watching the fields. The sky above the fields slowly shifted from gray to pale blue. Dawn in Ukraine often arrives gently across farmland. The darkness does not disappear all at once. Instead, the land reveals itself piece by piece as the first light spreads across fields, roads, and distant tree lines. From the hilltop, the Ukrainian scout watched that change carefully. The binoculars remained steady in his hands as he continued scanning the terrain below. In the early minutes of morning, details begin to appear that are hidden during the night. Low fences become visible, narrow dirt paths emerge from the shadows. Farmhouses and barns that once blended into the darkness begin to stand apart from the land around them. For someone watching the horizon, every small detail matters. The scout shifted slightly behind the patch of grass where he had positioned himself. The hill offered a clear view across several directions. To the north, long rows of farmland stretched toward a distant cluster of buildings that marked the edge of a small village. Thin lines of trees followed the course of irrigation ditches that farmers had dug years before the war arrived. To the east, the dirt road that had drawn attention during previous days curved between two wide fields. The road eventually disappeared behind a dense tree line that separated one part of the countryside from another. And to the south, scattered farmhouses stood quietly among open fields where tall grass moved slowly with the wind. The Ukrainian scout studied each direction carefully. Watching is not simply about looking. It is about learning the normal rhythm of a landscape. Only when a soldier understands how a place normally appears can he recognize when something has changed. The wind shifted slightly as the sun rose higher behind the horizon. Light reached the upper branches of trees far in the distance. The scout lowered the binoculars for a moment and listened. Silence remained across the farmland. No engines, no distant rumble of vehicles, no movement along the dirt road that curved through the fields. Behind the hill, the Ukrainian defensive position remained quiet as well. The soldiers stationed there had spent the night maintaining watch over the same terrain. They trusted the hilltop observer to give them early warning if anything appeared across the open ground. Down below, one of the soldiers adjusted his position beside the sandbags and glanced toward the hill. From his position, the scout appeared only as a small shape against the grass near the crest, but everyone understood the importance of that watch. The scout returned the binoculars to his eyes. Now the light had grown strong enough to reveal distant details more clearly. A line of wooden fences appeared near the road. The roofs of two barns reflected the first sunlight of the morning, and beyond them, a wide field stretched toward the horizon. The scout scanned slowly, left, then right, then back again. Observation requires patience. Moments of action are rare compared to the long stretches of quiet attention that fill a soldier's day along the front. Minutes passed. The wind brushed across the hill again, carrying the scent of dry grass and soil. Somewhere far above, a bird circled slowly through the morning air. The scout adjusted his position slightly and continued watching. The road remained empty. The fields remained still. Nothing unusual appeared among the distant tree lines. Eventually, the scout lowered the binoculars again. He took a slow breath and looked across the land without magnification. From the hilltop, the countryside of Ukraine spread outward in calm silence. It was difficult to imagine that the same fields had seen movement only days earlier. But along the front, quiet moments often arrive between periods of tension. The important thing was that someone remained watching. After another few minutes, a voice reached him faintly from below. One of the soldiers near the defensive position called up toward the hill. "Anything?" The scout turned slightly and answered without raising his voice. "Nothing moving." The response traveled down the slope clearly enough. The soldier below nodded and returned to his position behind the sandbags. Up on the hill, the scout lifted the binoculars again. The sun had now climbed high enough to illuminate most of the farmland below. Tree shadows stretched across the fields. The dirt road stood clearly visible between two wide patches of grass. Still empty, still quiet. Watching continued. The scout understood that observation was not about a single glance at the horizon. It was about remaining patient long enough to notice the smallest change. The sky grew brighter. Morning had fully arrived across that stretch of Ukraine. The scout remained on the hill, still scanning, still studying the land that spread quietly below him. Then, after another careful sweep of the horizon, he spoke quietly once more. The words were calm, steady, almost reflective. "We keep watch." The binoculars returned to his eyes, the fields remained silent, and the Ukrainian scout continued observing the land from the hill above the fields of Ukraine. By the time the sun rose fully above the horizon, the fields below the hill were clear in the morning light. What had been shadows only an hour earlier now appeared as open farmland stretching toward distant villages. The narrow dirt road that curved through the countryside could be seen in full detail, its pale surface cutting between fields that had already begun to dry under the growing warmth of the day. From the crest of the hill, the Ukrainian scout continued his watch. The binoculars remained steady in his hands as he slowly moved his gaze across the landscape once more. Left to right, then back again. Observation requires repetition. Every sweep of the horizon confirms what the last one revealed. The road remained empty, no vehicles appeared along the fields, no movement broke the quiet surface of the farmland. Below the hill, the Ukrainian defensive position continued its routine. One soldier adjusted the sandbags that formed the outer edge of the position. Another checked his equipment beside the small shelter dug into the earth along the slope. The men there had spent the night listening to the wind moving through the grass and watching the distant horizon. Now, with the morning light revealing the entire landscape, their attention remained focused on the same task, holding the line. But their view of the land was limited by the rise of the hill itself. That was why the scout remained above them. From the hilltop, nothing across those fields could move without eventually crossing his line of sight. The scout shifted his position slightly to relieve the pressure in his legs. The grass around him bent gently in the wind as he adjusted. For a moment, he lowered the binoculars and simply looked across the countryside with his own eyes. Morning had settled fully over the land. Birds moved across the sky. The distant roofs of farmhouses reflected sunlight in small flashes as the day grew brighter. To someone far from the front, the landscape might have looked peaceful, but the soldiers stationed in that region of Ukraine understood that quiet fields could change quickly. That was why the watch continued. The scout raised the binoculars again and examined the dirt road carefully. The road curved around the edge of a field before disappearing behind a cluster of trees. If anything moved from beyond those trees, the hill would be the first place it could be seen. Several long minutes passed. Nothing appeared. The scout shifted his focus toward the north. A line of thin trees followed the edge of a shallow ditch that cut across the farmland. He studied that area carefully. The shadows beneath the trees remained still. No movement. He continued scanning. Then he lowered the binoculars once more and listened. The wind carried only the soft sound of grass brushing against itself. Behind him, a faint voice reached the hill again from the defensive position below. One of the soldiers had stepped forward along the slope. His voice traveled clearly in the quiet morning air. "Still clear?" The scout turned slightly toward the voice. He answered calmly, "Still clear." The soldier below raised a hand in acknowledgement and returned to his post. The scout turned back toward the fields. The routine continued, watching the road, watching the fields, watching the tree lines where distant movement might appear. Across Ukraine, hills like this one have become places where quiet observation shapes the course of a day. Sometimes the watch ends with nothing more than a calm report. Sometimes the first sign of change appears suddenly along the horizon, but every morning begins the same way. Someone climbs the hill. Someone looks out across the land. Someone keeps watch. The Ukrainian scout remained where he was. The sunlight now reached fully across the slope beneath him, illuminating the grass that moved slowly with the wind. He took another careful look through the binoculars. The road, empty. The fields, still. The distant buildings near the village, unchanged. The watch had done its work. After one final scan of the horizon, the scout lowered the binoculars and rested them briefly against his chest. Then he spoke quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had studied the land carefully. "Nothing today?" Below the hill, the soldiers returned their attention to their positions. The defensive line remained ready. The farmland beyond them remained silent. And above it all, on the small rise overlooking the fields of Ukraine, the watch that began before dawn had carried the morning safely forward.